All right, welcome, critters. I am Claire Jones, your devoted host of the Sacred Reading CR podcast, where we examine and discuss Critical Role episodes, plot lines, and characters through the lens of sacred reading practices. This particular episode is about Campaign 1, Episode 1, but it's Part 2. And joining me today is Alyssa, who has been loving this series for a while now. How long have you been a fan?
I was a quarantine bandwagoner, so
Right.
March of 2020-ish, so almost 2 years. Not quite, but close.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty decent time chunk for Critical Role consumption.
It's been long enough for me to get through everything, which, given how much there is kind of an accomplishment.
It is. It really is. There's a lot. So please join us as we embark on this exciting adventure in story analysis and self-reflection in order to deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And as always, we love hearing your own insights and stories as well. So comment, like, and subscribe below. Ready? All right, let's dive in. So, as we open this podcast episode, Vox Machina has just found themselves after a chaotic altercation. Wow, that word did not want to come out of my mouth right there. Chaotic altercation where Trinkets, Vex's bear companion, was mistaken as a wild bear. Then they spend the night in the Tavern Inn that they currently are hosted up in, and they decide to go present their gift to the Gray Spines, who are the owners of the mines that they are trying to gain access to. It takes them a couple tries to find the correct Gray Spine, but they find him, gift him the ale, and get permission to enter the mines to retrieve Kima, who is the halfling that they were tasked by Lady Alora Visorin to return home, why they are in Kraghammer in the first place. As they leave, they are confronted with a group of goblins and ogres who are desperately escaping from the mine tunnels as they flee from an unidentifiable mutant five-headed monster that has presumably been birthed, from the foretold evils beneath the mines. Vox Machina joins the fight against the goblins, ogres, and this weird monstrosity. And that's where the episode ends, at the end of this fight after Scanlan delivers the final blow in all of his Scanlan glory. I believe it's his first kill of the
And
series.
One of his only. Yeah.
Yeah. But he eats it up in classic Scanlan fashion.
Of course he does.
So as we think about this particular episode, what actually happened here? What came up for you as we were going through the second half here?
I watched this episode a couple times because I have a really hard time paying attention to combat when I'm rewatching it, and that was a huge part of this last half. But the thing that came up for me the second time around was this barrel of ale that they rely on for everything. It is their key into every piece of the second half of the episode. And they're just going to tug on that string until it ends and hope it gets them far enough. I was kind of amused.
Yeah, it's their Hail Mary.
So heavily. Yeah.
It
really is.
So what kind of allegorical images, stories, songs, or metaphors showed up for us in this half?
I think that the biggest thing that I noticed was that because they're so out of place, they've got that one trick pony that they keep going back to. So they're really not stepping out of their comfort zone the entire time. They're picking that one thing that works and sticking with it and hoping, because they don't know what else to do. And that comes down to that barrel of ale, but it also comes down to putting Vex in front and kind of pushing her forward and making her more of the face of the party than maybe she would have been otherwise.
Yeah, and I don't know if she necessarily likes it. Like that's kind of a question in my mind. It's like, does she like being the face of the party?
I think one thing that I noticed is at one point, Vax pushes her forward and she says, "Not yet." Like she's got her own way of doing this, and they're not necessarily letting her do it her way. So I don't know if it's so much that she dislikes being the face of the party as she dislikes having to do it on their timeline.
Yeah. For me, I noticed that there is an interesting mix of direct and indirect communication styles here across the party. And it's really interesting because on the surface level, it would seem that direct communication would be more effective than indirect communication, like just conceptually. But we are seeing the opposite here, really. Because for the most part, Vex, Vax, Percy, and Scanlan, they have a more indirect style in the way that they cajole and charm people that they come in contact with in order to get what they want. But Tiberius, Grog, and Keyleth are much more direct, saying exactly what they think, exactly what they want out of a situation. And you can see this in the way that Vax and Vex make unfulfilled promises to the guards to let them into the higher end part of town where the Gracevines manor is. It's quite effective, although it is dishonest and manipulative.
And maybe temporary.
And temporary, yeah, for sure. And then we see Tiberius fail time and time and time again at getting what he wants. Most notably here in his attempt in the first half of this episode to get into the home of the city's well-known mage family. And he's very direct in his approach, though. Like first he tries to approach the house on foot, alone, mind you, which was just a bad decision-making process to begin with. But then he notices the protective magical barrier surrounding the property. And then he directly tries some spells against the barrier, but all of his attempts fail. And he gets super frustrated as a result. So it is direct, but it's ineffective. But the indirect approach isn't always effective either. Like we see with Vax's failed attempt to pilfer some of that ale from the barrel after they gift it to the Gracevine, which bad decision making again.
It's a choice. Not necessarily a good choice, but it's a choice.
Yeah. But it's interesting because you'd think that direct would be more emotionally intelligent, but we are seeing that Vex, Vax, Percy, and Scanlan, their ability to read and understand people come into play here. They might be manipulating them, but they're doing so out of an understanding of human behavior. So maybe I'd want to switch out the word like indirect for accommodating here, because they are taking into account how they think people will interpret their asks and shaping their requests accordingly. It's actually a more empathetic approach, strangely enough, which for me is a really interesting dynamic to look at.
Yeah. I think Percy especially has stepped up into that kind of communicative role this part of the episode. And honestly, coming from his background, he's probably trained in it. That probably has a lot to do with the way that he approaches these situations, because they are trying to talk to diplomats and lords. And all of a sudden, Percy's in his element, and we start to see him and his communication style more. And I almost feel like Vex especially starts to mirror him. He's one of the first to speak up, and he kind of shapes the tone of the conversation. So I think his style of communication really influences how they're talking to each other and talking to the people they're trying to gain favor with for this entire back half of the episode.
Yeah. It's not to get too much into shipping discourse, but we see the like foundational rumbles of ships starting to, and it's just the first episode. Like that's what I find really interesting about the whole series, is that you can actually see the threads starting out very early on. Like I actually noticed this about Vax and Keyleth in this part of the episode. Like there's some, I don't remember what the exact situation was, but there's some point where like Vax steps up for like Keyleth's idea or something like that.
He was druid crafting flowers on the barrel of ale.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I was just like, it's just delicious to see those like little threads start to form.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to pick up on them now than it was the first time. But they're definitely there and they're fun.
Yeah. So what kind of personal experiences are coming up for us here from our own lives?
I think the biggest one for me was when you start a new job and you're trying to navigate professionalism versus making friends. And it's this weird tightrope that's really hard to walk. And I think coming back to work from the pandemic, it's kind of a refresher in that. Like I haven't seen my coworkers in a year and a half. We've been off site for the entire time. And so like there's built up dynamics in Vox Machina already. But they're still very much learning about each other. They're still very much learning how to interact with each other. And so there's an existing team. You know, I'm going back to work with an existing team. But it's still feels new. It still feels like we're learning about each other and learning how to function together. I think Vox Machina has this added thing of trying to navigate a whole new town. Which isn't necessarily part of my current experience, but has been in the past, where, you know, you start a new job in a new city, in a new state. And it's all this complicated relationship stuff of trying to figure out where people stand and how to work with them. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with Vox Machina right now.
I love that comparison there, like, because adventuring parties are very much akin to office work dynamic, you know, like having a coworker cadre versus having an adventuring party. Like there's very strong similarities. Like you're all trying to achieve a common goal, right, together, but you have disparate personalities that are coming into play and different skill sets that are coming into play. And how do you harness the energy of everyone in a very effective way? And it actually, you know, reminds me of how well the Critical Role cast has transitioned into business management over the years too.
Right.
And I think it's really due to their experience in this adventuring party context. Is like they understand what each other's strengths are and weaknesses are, and likes and passions and genius zones are, as well as their dynamics with working together. And so transitioning into business management was actually pretty seamless for them.
Yeah, I think that they had the chance to really build up to it through their role playing that we see on stream. We'll never know what goes on behind the scenes. You know, that's their own system, but through role playing, they've really had a chance to work out where strengths and weaknesses might lie and what kind of skill sets that people are willing to share and willing to work with, because you might have a skill set but not be overly fond of using it. And being vulnerable in front of the entire internet for 7 years or whatever it is. They've really had a chance to work through a lot of the drama before they became their own company. And I think we can see a lot of the start of Critical Role as a company as much as we see the start of Vox Machina here.
Totally. Like that's actually been one of my biggest inspirations watching them over the years, is like how they handled their professionalism as voice actors as well. Like, and media personalities too. Like I remember Marisha actually talks about this in I actually think it was like a Google interview that she did. I saw it on YouTube randomly at some point in time, and she was talking about how they've specifically tested content that is more actor focused versus content that is more like gamer focused, to see like what the audience responses were to, should we do like content focused on Travis and Brian, or should we do content focused on, you know, critters and the critter community and critter content. Like between the pages, between the sheets was actually a experimental content for them. Is like, what happens when we do a deep dive into these people as media personalities rather than like players in a D&D campaign. Yeah. And it's been really interesting to see how they've been almost strategically approaching their content creation in that way.
Yeah, I think that they've done a lot of really fun things as a company, and had the chance to try out a lot of very off the wall stuff that never would have flown.
Yeah.
You know, 5 years ago.
Yeah, totally.
But in the best way. We've gotten some really good stuff out of it.
Yeah. And personally for me, when it comes to like the communication styles that we're seeing in this episode, is that I'm personally a communication styles nerd. Like obviously I study it. And I'm a huge advocate for the radical candor approach that is made popular by the author Kim Scott. And her whole premise is to care personally, but address directly when communicating with others. And so it's this kind of balance between these two approaches that these two groups of characters are taking here. And then I'm also a huge fan of Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, who advocates for I statements over you statements and trying to avoid like the microaggressions that can pop up in conversations with people and seemingly benign conversations. So over the 5+ years or so, I have actually been actively trying to improve my own communication styles as a result of this studying that I've been doing, trying to be more direct, more honest, more straightforward without being maliciously blunt or hurtful. You know, there's a fine balance. There's an art when it comes to communication in that. And there's a really fine line between speaking directly while also caring about how the other person or persons will interpret what you're saying. And that's what's coming up for me in all of this. Like if you lean too much toward direct honestly, like Keyleth, Tiberius, Grog, you can offend and hurt people. But if you lean too much towards caring about their reactions, then you can end up sugarcoating things too much and lying to make them feel better. And it seems like these Vox Machina characters are still navigating that balance too. Like, is that interaction with the guards and like that temporary lie that they'll give them ale to, is that harmful? Is that hurtful? Is it like, do we focus on the means rather than the goal? Like, how do they navigate those moral quandaries, really, at the end of the day?
And how much is justified versus, you know, how much is just to make their own lives easier? You know, there's a lot going on there in the way that they navigate this whole situation. Yeah.
And that's honestly one of the things that I love about watching these voice actors do their thing. Because you can clearly tell that a lot of these habits and attitudes are intentional character choices. Like, especially with Travis and Grog. Like, he's one of my favorite character studies in this series because Travis is a very well-rounded, intelligent person. You know, he's a delight. But Grog has an intelligence of 6 out of 20. And he plays it off really, really well throughout the series. Like, there are times where you see Travis bleeding into the game, like especially when combat strategy is being discussed. Like, you can tell that Travis is just like biting his tongue a lot of the time. But for the most part, he pretty much stays true to character and plays that dumb himbo Grog that we all love. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see not only the characters navigate these nuances, but also the actors navigating the nuances via the characters.
Yeah. And like, we all know Matt is a big fan of consequences for your actions.
Yeah.
And like, we're really starting to see that even from the first episode of this show, of, they're lying their way through checkpoints, and they're, making political deals that maybe they don't have really in their back pocket. They're doing a lot of things to get to this place that can and will very well come back to bite them. But even now, we're seeing the consequences of Vex going off and flirting with the guard from the first half of the episode, where he's no longer an option. He's not there for them to play off of anymore.
Yeah.
So there's some very subtle ones, but we're starting to see consequences, and we're like, that's something that's going to carry through all of Critical Role.
Go ahead.
It's a lot of fun to start picking up on those things already.
Yeah, it reminds me of your comment from last episode when it comes to creative battle choices and like creative solutions to the situations that you find yourself in. And I think Matt really encourages that in the way that he DMs, because he doesn't leave the same solutions on the table time and time again. And so the characters and the actors have had to be really creative in the way that they interact with the DM's problems, like that he presents to them. Like it's a nurturing relationship there.
Yeah. I think it makes it fun for them as much as it makes it fun for us to watch.
Yeah, and like you can even see this going to campaign 2, is like when they have 2 clerics in the party, Matt really gets challenged to make battles like a very anxiety-inducing experience, because if you have 2 clerics and you can pretty much bring everyone back up throughout the battle, I mean, some people might die, but it's at a lot less rate than Vox Machina.
Yeah, that is true.
And so you can see Matt getting frustrated a lot during campaign 2 and being like, all right, I really have to challenge you guys with these encounters. And you can see the beginning of Matt learning those lessons for himself in campaign 1.
Yeah, I think for that specific example, it was a huge shock to go from like half a cleric to 2.
Yeah.
I love Pike, but she's not there a whole lot.
Yeah.
And so it gets really interesting to see everybody adapt, including Matt. Like, this is a huge growth experience just for him.
Totally.
Like, it's a growth experience for everybody, but it's really interesting to see where Matt started with all of this.
Yeah. So what actions are we being called to take now that we've had these insights with this juicy episode? What are we going to do now?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is stepping out of my comfort zone. You know, it's so easy to just do the same thing over and over and over again until it stops working. But I think the thing that really came out of this episode for me was, you're gonna benefit from stepping outside of that. Whether that's because you're not putting yourself in a hole of how many bottles of ale that you have to eventually figure out how to steal. There's a huge benefit, and I see this as a bit of a warning story of getting stuck on your one-trick pony of, they're doing the same thing over and over again, and you can feel it building up, and it's going to come back to bite them. And so I think the thing that I feel called to from this episode is to not do that, and to really step outside of what I know works, and try to take a step towards something different, even if it's not the most comfortable.
Yeah. You can't put all of your eggs in one Hail Mary ill cast basket.
Whatever we want to call it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really being called to be more compassionate to myself. That's really what's coming to mind for me, because it's really easy to hold these binary mindsets. Like, direct communication is good, indirect is bad, but really it's a huge gray spectrum. Like, there's a whole lot of space in between those 2 binaries. And it's really easy to criticize myself and be like, oh, I was too indirect in this conversation, so clearly I'm bad at communication, like punishing myself as a result. But really, one, conversations are a two-way thing, so part of the onus is on the other person anyway. And two, it takes a balance between direct and indirect to be most effective here. So moral of the story being, I'm going to be nicer to myself. That's really the action that I'm being called to take.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair.
Yeah, but like I love the idea of going outside your comfort zone too, because like that's a lesson that we all need to continually practice too. Because once our comfort zone expands to hold that extra room, then we need to expand it even more. It's like an ever evolving process.
I think they're both lessons that we might already know, but need to be reminded of continually.
Totally.
Because it's so easy to start falling into a binary and start forgetting that there are shades of gray. And it's so easy to just feel comfortable and forget to push that boundary. And so I think that a lot of what we're learning here is stuff we may already know, but that we need to be reminded of.
Yeah, and that's what I really do love about the sacred reading process. Like I've actually been really getting into The Witcher lately and using like my sacred reading practices as I watch The Witcher as well. And like you can really apply it to everything that you consume, because it's just a catalyst for this self-reflective process. Because again, we're talking about universal themes here. Like most media, most forms of art, most shows have these universal themes built into it because that's part of the human experience. But we all need that storytelling to remind ourselves of these practices.
Yeah, and I think that The Witcher especially is a great venue for sacred reading. I think that there's a lot there.
I'm like, oh man, am I going to start another podcast?
But I've really enjoyed bringing it specifically to Critical Role, just because, you know, they didn't plan this out. Like in storytelling, it's so much easier to pick up themes when they're deliberately put there. And a lot of the themes in Critical Role, especially early Critical Role, weren't planned. Like you can't plan a D&D show.
So I love that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to like really see these things just happen naturally.
Yeah, because when you bring humans together in a storytelling context, even if it's an improv storytelling context, the same themes emerge. Like, because we have the same themes as human beings across centuries of living.
Yeah, and they're the ones that make the stories that we love, and there's a reason that we love them.
Yeah, because we are story animals. Like our brains are wired for story. So, and we're evolutionarily wired that way.
Yeah, makes it a lot of fun.
All right, so these are some really powerful themes that we're talking about here. And I mean, talking to the audience, we definitely want to encourage you to share your own thoughts, insights, and stories with us along the way. We'd love to know how Critical Role has impacted you in your own lives as well, because I mean, our being here is evidence enough that it's impacted us significantly in our lives. So special thanks to Alyssa for joining me on this episode. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me.
It's been so fun to be back. It's I really enjoy doing this.
Yeah, me too. So next time we're going to be discussing Campaign 1, Episode 2, Part 1. And joining me will be Petal. It'll be a new guest, and I'm excited to see her perspective on it as well. So I'm always looking for other co-hosts and guests. So if you're interested in coming on this podcast with me and sharing your perspectives, please reach out to me via email or on Tumblr, and I'll send you the sign-up form. So I can't wait to chat with all of you, because it's a huge, loving, wonderful community at the end of the day, right? So in the meantime, please comment, like, and subscribe below. Follow us on Tumblr at Sacred Reading CR. At Sacred Reading CR. I don't know why I wanted to put podcast at the end of that. for all the juicy updates. And until next time, may all beings be peaceful, may all beings be free, and always, always, always remember to love each other. Take care.
Bye.